in Colossians, the Apostle Paul uses a term to describe the importance of Jesus to his church. Paul refers to our Lord as the head. I want you to think about your head for just a moment. How important is your head to your body? It's pretty important. This is what Paul means when he says that Jesus is the head over all things to his church, which is his body. 1, 22, and 23. And he repeats that truth later in Ephesians, referring to Jesus as the head of the church. And to the Colossians, by the way, Ephesians and Colossians are written about the same time, where he says to the Colossian saints that Jesus is the head of the body. He is the church, the head of the church. And you see that in Colossians 1:18. There is a vital relationship between a head and a body. You can lose body parts. You can lose some of them and you probably don't even know it. Appendix. You can lose an appendix and probably don't even have any consequences afterward for not having an appendix. But you really can't lose your head. We talk about people losing their head, say they lost their temper or something, but we don't really mean losing your head. You have to have your head. And when Paul says of the Colossians they were guilty of not holding the head, in chapter 2, they were not holding the head. Look at verse 19. From which all the body by joints and bands, having nourishment ministered and knit together, increases with the increase of God. There is a relationship between the head and the body, at least as it relates to the church. And so I would say it this way, the head is primary. Without the head, there is no body. And the statement is not just a formality. Jesus is the leader of his church. He is the true vine. And we're all just branches. It doesn't matter what position you hold. It doesn't matter how influential you are. You're just a branch on the vine. And the consequence of that truth is that Jesus alone has preeminence. Paul bases this argument on two important premises. First, Jesus is supreme because he's the creator. You look back at chapter 1, verses 16 to 18. For by him were all things created, in heaven and in earth. Everything was made by him and for him. And not only that, number two, Jesus is supreme because he is the creator, but he's supreme because he gave himself for the church. Ephesians 5:25. This reference to redemption is important because it explains that more than just creative authority, Jesus now has redemptive authority. Jesus made you and he bought you. And do you remember that little illustration of the boy who lost his boat? It's a made-up story. I've heard it all my life. Little boy makes a little boat, goes out on the lake and sails it, and he loses the boat. Gust of wind takes the boat out in the lake. A few weeks later, he's going by a shop in town, and he sees the boat he made in the window, and it's for sale. Somebody found the boat and sold it to the pawn shop. And so he works odd jobs to save his money. He goes back, he buys his boat. Now in the story, I always thought as a child, why didn't he just make another boat? But anyway, he worked really hard to buy this boat back. I guess there was something personally special about this boat. But he gets his boat and he says in the illustration, I made you and I bought you. Now I'll tell you, some pastor somewhere made up that story just to illustrate this truth. But it's a good story for that, so that's why I gave it to you. Jesus has authority over his church because he created the church and he owns the church. Nobody else created the church and nobody else owns the church. You have a gift from Jesus to his church, which is the under-shepherd. That's the pastor of the church. But even as he's the pastor, the real leader is Jesus. He's the one who leads the church. And he is the one who sets up in the church positions of authority as visible representation of his leadership. The pastor of a church could be one person. It can be more than one. Some churches have multiple pastors. It's a gift of Jesus to his church. Ephesians 4:11. The pastor is a shepherd of God's flock. He is responsible to God to provide spiritual sustenance, to meet the actual spiritual need of God's sheep. the church, Acts 20:28. Paul actually says to them, feed the flock of God, Ephesian pastors. Even as Jesus is the good shepherd who gave up his life for the sheep, John 10, verse 11, so the pastor is an under shepherd. He serves by the will of the chief shepherd. Now in the New Testament, the word pastor is only one of 3 words that really tell us who the pastor is. The pastor is the overseer. He is the episkopos. The word episcopal comes from that. He oversees the church. He is an elder. That's the word presbyteros, or word Presbyterian is derived from that word. And that has to do with having maturity. And then the word shepherd, that's the word poimen, and it means pastor. When we translate your word pastor, it comes from that word. All 3 titles are really referring to one individual or one type of individual, let me say it that way. And from these titles, we might add a 4th title, which would be angel or messenger from Revelation 1 through 3. And from these titles, you get a sense of the duties and requirements of the office of pastor. The pastor oversees the church, he leads the church, and he functions as the one who provides spiritual guidance to the church. He has a message from the Lord to the congregation. So in that sense, he's the preacher. But he's really more than just the preacher. Some people say to me, especially here in the South, they'll call me preacher. Some people will say minister. Those are titles that they give the pastor, but they really aren't all-encompassing in what a pastor is. I think you understand. Now, the qualifications of a pastor are very important. And of course, we'll look at this in a moment of how important it is when it relates to people who aren't qualified. One of the most difficult aspects of an individual's qualification for pastoral ministry is the determination of whether that person is called to be a pastor. And I use the word called in quotes because there is no New Testament expression calling to be the pastoral ministry. Let me say it this way. Every church member is called to ministry. Every single one. Every Christian is called to ministry. Okay? Some are called to pastoral ministry. Some are called to other types of ministry. But there is no special calling to pastoral ministry. I actually got into a pretty interesting discussion with an older man on a podcast on this topic. And he said some things that were actually a little bit insulting. But because he was an older man, I just kind of let it go. But I was thinking in my mind, I'm going to write about this topic, and I'm really going to hammer this position. So, and then as I was writing, I thought, well, I should be a little gracious. So I didn't include the story here. But I'll just tell you. The people say, well, I'm called. Great, that just means you're a Christian, okay? We're all called, all right? If you're not called, you're not a Christian. If you are a Christian, you are called. So the first step of saying, should a person recognize his calling to be a pastor as versus a calling to just be a layman in the church, how does he do that? And the first step of that is entirely subjective. Do you want to be a pastor? That's the question you ask. Does this individual really desire that? The Apostle Paul indicates that a pastor should internally covet the biblical office itself. 1 Timothy 3, if a man desires to be an overseer, one of the titles for pastor, he desires a good work. That's the internal word for coveting, for lusting. It's a good kind of lust. He desires to have that. He desires to be a pastor. And then I think in some cases, people learn, they have that, they learn what a pastor does, and then they don't want to do that. And there's nothing wrong with that, in my mind. Person says, you know what, I just realized there's a lot of good I can do in the church that doesn't involve me actually taking on the office of pastor. I don't think that's what I want to do, and I think that's fine. Some men train in Bible colleges and seminaries, and when they get there, here's things they hear. If you can do anything other than be a pastor, then you should. And I think what people mean when they say that is that if you learn, when you train to be a pastor, that this isn't what God really wants you to do because you don't have that internal desire, then don't feel obligated to keep going down this path for yourself. You can feel free to do something else. If you're not fully committed to this, I'll just tell you, it won't work out. And I don't think that's wrong. I think we put too much emphasis. That guy used to be a pastor. Or that guy used to be a missionary. And he's not. Is that wrong? Is there anything in the Bible that says that's wrong? I can't find anything. People try to link that to Demas, or they try to link that to Mark and all that kind of thing. That's taking a position that the Bible never takes at all. And I think what it does is it locks some men into doing something they really don't desire to do. And that's the worst kind of situation. And I'm just going to tell you, as a church, you don't want a person as your pastor who doesn't want to be your pastor. That would be terrible. It would be miserable, both for pastor and for church. Both 1 Timothy and Titus provide additional information as to whether a man is qualified to pursue vocational ministry. I think this really gives us the sense not just of whether he desires this, but now is he qualified to do it. And there are some ideas behind this. First of all, he must have the kind of character that is unreproachable, it's blameless. The word has to do with not having handles. There's nothing you can hold on to. Like Daniel in the Old Testament, this person desires to be a man of integrity, against whom no legitimate charge can be brought. The Greek word itself conveys the idea there's nothing in the individual's life to which other people can hold. There's nothing that person could say, look at this man's life. He's really not qualified in character to be a pastor. It doesn't mean he's sinless. There are no sinless pastors. You know that. But only the Lord Jesus was without sin. But it means that the pastor's character is such that he cannot be publicly rebuked. The second word here actually has the same idea, that no accuser can come forward with a charge, Titus 1 verse 6. There cannot be anything in the pastor's life that can be used as a charge of moral sin against him. Now, the fact that he should be above reproach is non-negotiable. It's non-negotiable. It's not something we can just haggle over. In both passages, Paul uses the word must to highlight the importance of character in a pastor's life. And it's such a strong emphasis because Paul's teachers were notoriously lacking in moral character. You read 2 Peter, you read Jude, you find out that the false teachers were actually teaching that grace would allow them to sin in moral ways, being immoral, and it was okay. And so I think Paul is highlighting here that cannot be going on. So a pastor's character must be above reproach. Secondly, his conduct must be above reproach. Out of a life of moral character arises appropriate pastoral demeanor, a conduct that befits the high office of God's ambassador, under shepherds to the chief shepherd. He is God's steward for managing the affairs of the church. He should be faithful. He should be the husband of one wife. And the way it's written here by Paul is the honor to a gune. That is, he's husband to wife. Many have debated what that means. Let me give you 4 possible interpretations. Some say it means he has to be a husband, that he must be married. So if you're a single person and you desire to be a pastor, you are not qualified because in conduct you are not married. That's what some people believe. Others believe it means that a pastor doesn't necessarily have to be married, but that if he is married, he must only be married once in his lifetime. So even if his wife dies 3 weeks into their marriage, he can no longer marry. He was the husband of a wife, but it's husband of one wife. They really get that idea of oneness there. The word one there, by the way, means they take that to mean me. It's the word miad. They take it to mean once in his life. Number 3, the third interpretive position prohibits someone from being a pastor if he's ever been married and is divorced. And I will tell you that there's a lot that has been written since about 1960 on the subject of divorce and marriage, and the word that we've added that's not actually in our Bible, remarriage, and ex-spouse. Those terms aren't in the Scripture. But the church has added those terms, not necessarily wrong, but added those terms as a way of understanding the current situation in which we live. I will tell you, very interesting, if you go back and read people who were writing back 400 years ago, even 200 years ago, you will find that they had a much different view on this subject than a lot of modern day people. And I think the writing actually up into the 1950s is a lot different. But you kind of hit the 1960s, and at least in the Western world, United States, Britain, and Europe, you start finding a much different approach, which is the approach there is no divorce, no remarriage. And that's the terms they use. I think the fourth position is actually the position Paul is advocating. Paul's not writing to an American audience today. He's writing to people in his audience, and he says the pastor must be presently faithful to the spouse that he has. And I think that's the most likely interpretation. If you want to discuss that with me, I would be glad to lay out my biblical arguments as to why I believe that's the better of the positions. But I would encourage you to go and look at the question of the widow in 1 Timothy 5 and start looking at how she was to be wife of one husband. It's a flip all the way around. And if you start reading that passage, what it's obviously talking about there is she was a woman who was faithful to the husband that she had. Okay? It wasn't talking about any kind of divorce in marriage type of situation. So I can go through a lengthy explanation. And you can probably read. By the way, if you want to find somebody who disagrees with me on that, there are literally hundreds of people online, thousands of people online. You can find, and some of them are great scholars, and some of them are really lousy scholars. So you can find people, but that's my view. He must be faithful. He must be sent. By the way, even if we just disagree, we can all say he must be faithful, right? I think we all agree with that. At least with that. Number two, he ought to be sensible. And I think this is talking about some stability. Some pastors are always moving and changing. Do you know the average tenure now for a pastor is now 6 years. Even just a few years ago it was 3 years. For a youth pastor, it's a year and a half, 18 months. I think the reason for the tenure being so low is that what you have is pastors get into a church, and there's what they call the honeymoon period, and it usually lasts about 18 months to 2 years. That's where everybody in the church is getting to know the pastor, and the pastor's getting to know them. After 2 years, everybody kind of knows the pastor and his family. They all know the church. There's a lot of friction that goes on, and then I'm going to start looking for another church. That takes about a year, and then there's your 3 years, and then moving to another church. Some pastors are actually pastor of 8, 10 churches in their lifetimes. I don't think that's really what the New Testament had in mind. I think the pastor should be temperate in his spirit, not rash in his decisions, sensible in judgment, self-control, curbing his passions in order to behave right. His conduct should be considered modest and orderly. He should abstain from intoxication, even slight intoxication. And I would tell you that if I was talking to other pastors in this room, I would say this: avoid alcohol as a recreational beverage. Just don't do it. I actually think that when Paul writes Timothy and tells him to take a little wine for his stomach's sake, he's writing that to him because after writing this to him, Timothy was saying, I'm not going to drink alcohol at all. And Paul now says, look, you've got this bug from drinking water. Drink a little alcohol medicinally for your stomach's sake. So I think medicinal use is different from recreational beverage use. And again, I can go through that with you if you're interested in talking about that. He must be friendly. I think that makes sense, doesn't it? What kind of situation would you have if you had an unfriendly pastor? It would be pretty miserable. You ought to have just a friendly demeanor. People should know he's a friendly guy. He shouldn't hole up in his study and refuse to have relationships with the people in the church. He should not be easily angry. He shouldn't be arrogant. His ministry should be to teach the truth to others. And sometimes that leads to conflict, like when people say, I don't agree with your position on divorce and remarriage. It can lead to conflict. Or I don't agree with your position on alcohol. Or just pick a position, there are thousands of them. And then all of a sudden you have difference of opinion and you have potential for conflict. So the pastor ought to be, in those situations, mild-mannered. He should not be hot-tempered. He shouldn't be quarrelsome. He shouldn't get into fistfights. I was at a church in Chicago many years ago, and they just had a pastor's fellowship. I was there and didn't see this happen because I was in another part of a very large church building, another part of the building. But apparently out in the lobby, one of the pastors went up to another pastor. Now this other pastor's brother had just died of cancer. And he went up to the other pastor and made a comment something like, God must have been judging your brother for giving him cancer and killing him. Okay? Can you imagine one pastor saying that to another pastor? And that pastor, having just lost his brother, looked at the man, pulled back his fist, and punched him right in the face. I'm so sorry I missed it. That would have been so exciting. These men in suits now scrappling on the floor of this church lobby. That's probably what we're talking about here. You shouldn't be doing that. That's not what you should be doing. There's a pastors' conference that goes up in northern Indiana, near Chicago, every year. It's called the Preacher School or something. It's with a group, an organization I have nothing to do with. But I had a friend who went once, and he has a twin brother, Mark and Mike. And Mark went there. His twin brother Mike had written some things that some other pastors didn't like. He was accosted in the parking lot of two young pastors who wanted to beat him up. They were actually ready to fight and beat him up. He was actually a little scared, even though Mark's a pretty big guy. He was a little scared because these two pastors were so angry and told him they were going to beat him up. And until they found out that he was a different guy, he was the wrong guy. That's exactly what this is talking about. Those people are not qualified to be pastors. In his finances, a pastor should not be greedy. He should not seek to be wealthy. I just read this afternoon of a man who calls himself a pastor in Texas who has a hangar for all of his private jets. Another man apparently is raising $54 million to buy a very nice top-end private jet. And his response to people who questioned that was, when Jesus was on earth, he rode a donkey, but if I think Jesus was alive today, he wouldn't be riding donkeys, he'd be flying around in a private jet to spread the gospel. And all I can say is, that doesn't seem to fit what Paul is talking about. He should not be known as someone who loves money and the lifestyle it affords, rather not serving money, but serving God, right? Don't lay up treasures on earth. That's for every Christian, not just pastors. It's inappropriate for a pastor to lay up money on earth at the same time. This kind of leadership is wrong. It's inappropriate. And say to his congregation, you should be serving God. He should demonstrate stability and self-control when it comes to budgeting and saving and spending. Now let me stop here for just a moment. I have a pastor friend who he and his wife, from the moment they were married, had planned a trip to another country as part of their 25th anniversary, and every year saved money, put money aside. And when they got to that point, they took this once-in-a-lifetime trip. And the response some of the people had in the church was, wow, we must be paying that guy too much. That's sinfully wrong. Sinfully wrong. And they didn't know. They just assumed this guy, well, look at his lifestyle. Look how great he has it. That's just wrong. They didn't know him, I guess, well enough to know that he wasn't living like that. He had been saving his money. I'm thankful. Listen, my wife can bleed money from where money did not come from. We must have a money tree in our garden that she goes out and pulls money from, because she, with saving and budgeting, she just has an amazing ability to do that. And I'm very thankful, because I'm the opposite. I grew up in a family where we used money for firewood. Just burn it. It's in our pockets, burning a hole. We've got to get rid of it somehow. It's like the hot potato. I don't want it. But she's able to do that. So I've been blessed because I've been able to do things I never would have been able to do if I didn't have that kind of budgeting and saving. And she's been a blessing to me that way. And then finally, in family, not finally, that's just the bottom of this page. Three more things. Family, the pastor's family should be faithful. Now, unfortunately, it's so notoriously bad for some pastors that there's actually, you have your own acronym. PK. And for missionaries, MK. Were you an MK? Yes, Debbie was an MK. And did you ever hear the word MK? Did you ever hear that? Yeah. Missionaries come to the church, We've had some MKs. Here. We've had some missionary kids who are great, and then we've had some MKs, okay? It happens sometimes. And sometimes my children have been pastors' kids, and sometimes they've been PKs, all right? So that's okay. We understand that nobody's perfect, but pastors cannot neglect their children and family to their own detriment. They should oversee their private affairs in a way that honors the Lord. And if the children live in the home, they ought to be faithful children, indicating they should have a Christian testimony of salvation, not living a morally wicked lifestyle, rejecting the leadership of their father. Pastors should be mature. not a new Christian, not a recent convert. It takes time to mature somebody in their faith. It doesn't happen overnight. You don't go through 12 lessons and all of a sudden, all right, I'm now a strong Christian. I think the Apostle Paul is an exception, we would all say, but even he didn't go right into ministry. He started off kind of trying to go right into ministry, and then some things didn't work out, and so he actually was out of official ministry for a number of years, the Apostle Paul, before he was brought back by Barnabas. And so I think it's fair to say that anybody who is a neophyte, he's new to the faith, should not be in leadership. Maturity in character and conduct also should be accompanied with maturity in handling God's word. Those who don't know their Bible very well will damage the church, will do great damage. Men who are training to be pastors should be given opportunities to practice, but in a controlled environment where pastoral oversight is present. Obviously, we want young men to be in the ministry. The age of pastors in America is increasing, the average age. I think now the average age is around 60 years old of American pastors. It was 30 years ago, it was in the 40s, and now it's in the 60s. Young men are not seeking out pastoral ministry at all, and older men are having to fill that role. And I don't have a problem with that. I think there might be partly from prolonged adolescence. Some young men are not capable of going to college at 18 and deciding this is what I want to do with my life, so I'm trained to be a pastor. I totally understand that. But I think it's very dangerous for the American church to realize their pastors are getting so old. So I think bringing up young men and training them and giving them opportunities is a good thing. And finally, his testimony should be with unbelievers in the community. Unbelievers who know him ought to say, we think he's a good guy. We don't agree with him. We totally think he's different and weird, but that's okay. He obviously loves the Lord. You can't lead a church in that community who's not known as a person of good conduct. So it's a matter of character, it's a matter of conduct, and it's a matter of giftedness. When a man may have some control over character and conduct, I think giftedness is something that God does. It's not something a seminary education can replace. I don't think you can simply educate your way to giftedness. I think maybe your education can augment your giftedness, but if the giftedness isn't there, then you shouldn't be pastoring a church. And I've actually known people who wanted to be pastors, but literally were not gifted for it. Particularly, they were not gifted with the ability to teach. Pastors have to be able to administrate in some ways, but they must have the gift of teaching. I don't mean they have to be charismatic. They don't have to be so incredibly soul-stirring and give the tear-jerking story and that kind of thing, but they must have the ability to communicate God's truth. They should be ordained. And I think when we talk about ordained, now we're dealing with the entrance exam to pastoral office in a singular, a church. I think the idea that there's some sort of test that's given and now you're a pastor for life is not what God intends. Ordination in Scripture is to a particular office in a particular church. Once an ordained pastor leaves that ministry, I think he relinquishes his pastoral authority conferred on him by ordination. Just because a person was a pastor doesn't mean that he is a pastor. I think if later he chooses to re-enter pastoral ministry, even immediately after relinquishing authority in one church, it can be almost immediate, one Sunday to the next, especially like a church planter. He may be the pastor of a church. I had a friend who was pastoring a church in Georgia, left that church to go pastor and plant a church in Florida. Sunday morning, he preached the morning message. Sunday night, a new pastor preached, and then they laid hands on him, the pastor from the morning service, to go out and plant the church in Florida. So what they were doing is they were conferring authority, the old church in Georgia, on him to go plant the church in Florida. That's kind of the way you see it in Scripture. So the idea that once ordained, always ordained is not a biblical concept. And I think it's really kind of problematic that most ordination councils only focus on a doctrinal statement. By the way, I've written an entire chapter on ordination that's part of an appendix to this that you can read if you're really interested. I think if our church ever goes back through the process of ordination, we've done it a few times, And I thought we did it fine, it was good. But if we ever go back through the process of ordination, we're going to go through it this way, the way that I'm approaching it now, which is it's to an office. We don't just ordain people to be ordained. They're going to be ordained to an office in a particular church, so that when they leave that, they get ordained again. By the way, if I died tomorrow, massive coronary, or all the other 4 diseases came upon me at once, I was talking about this morning, and I'm dead, and you all get the privilege of choosing a new pastor. Okay, don't look so excited. Some of the deacons are thinking, what's that? What was his life insurance policy? How much does the church get? If that happens, you will be bringing in a person, and he's going to be a candidate, and he's going to go through the process of candidation, whether it's a person in our church or a person outside the church. And that process of candidation, in my mind, is ordination. That's basically what you're doing. You're basically reordaining him, because even at the end, the men of the church, some of the men, the leaders, will stand up and lay hands on him and confer authority on him, saying, this man is our pastor. That's basically what ordination is. It's conferring authority. Now, unfortunately, there are fakes. And fakes are so dangerous. I've met fake pastors. I've met men who I thought, while I'm looking at it, this man has no business being in ministry as a pastor. Churches should avoid this. If someday you have to choose a pastor, beware of choosing a fake. The first is a false pastor. He's a wolf in sheep's clothing. That's the way the Bible describes in Matthew chapter 7. That term wolf, Paul uses in Ephesians 20, saying that there would arise within the pastors in the church of Ephesus wolves who would not spare the flock. The second kind of fake pastor is one who pretends to be a spiritual leader and is willing to lead when things are going well. So you have the wolf, and then you have the hireling who will lead while things are well, and then as soon as there's difficulty, he leaves. I think probably the people who jump from church to church to church are in danger of being hirelings. I'm not saying they are, because I'm sure there are good examples and good reasons sometimes why people do that. So let's not broad brush everybody. But let's also realize that if a person is jumping from church to church to church, it's possible that that person is a hireling. Because what happens to the hireling is as soon as there's trouble, he leaves. As soon as there's conflict, he leaves. The Bible calls these people pseudo-pastors. They're not true shepherds. To them, it's just a job, something they were hired to do. Jesus describes these as cowardly in the face of opposition. We've got a pastor friend here in the state. He was having a little bit of trouble with his deacons, and one of his deacons said to him, "This is not what we hired you to do." That's a really dangerous statement, isn't it? Really dangerous statement. And I think the pastor is a young man. He's made some mistakes there in his ministry, but truth is, the word hire is not a word I would use for pastor. I'd love to use a different word. I think that word is dangerous. Hirelings serve as long as they can make money. The emphasis is on income, not feeding and protecting God's flock. So what should a pastor be like with the people? One of the most important relationships in the church is between pastor and church member, a sense in which the pastor is a part of the church family. I look at it this way. On the one hand, I know I'm the pastor of the church. I know that. All right, I wake up with that. I go to bed with it. That's the burden I carry. That's okay. But I also feel like our family is just one of the church families. And I think that's okay. And I think that's how pastors should be. That's how their families should be. We're just regular members in a lot of ways. Pastors' names are in the directory. At the same time, there is something separate about the pastor from the rest of the congregation. I think about you differently, I imagine, than you think about me. I really do. I think about you in the sense of I have this obligation to help you in your spiritual life. I hope you think about that with me, but maybe you don't. But I really do think about that with you all the time. Those are burdens that keep you awake at night. I've had nights where I didn't sleep because of burdens of people. And they turn a pastor to prayer because the pastor must give an account of the congregation to God. So what should a pastor's relationship be? I think the best relationship is shoulder to shoulder. We're in this together. We're going to work together to advance God's word. A good pastor is not above the church, like a man who owns a factory. He's standing up in his office looking at all the workers down on the floor in that industry who are busy on the construction line, putting whatever the industry is, putting those things together. And he's sitting up in his office just kind of watching over everything. The pastor shouldn't be like that. The pastor works alongside church members day by day, help them grow in their Christian walk. And they should do the same for him. So while it's a formal office that carries many responsibilities which are different from a typical member's participation in the church, that relationship between pastor and member should be friendly, in a sense of, hey, we're all co-laborers for Christ. At the same time, the pastor realizes that he does not rule the church. Who rules the church? Jesus is the head, and we as Baptists believe that the congregation is the one who rules the church. I will tell you, there are a lot of Baptist churches who would say we believe in congregational rule, but they never practice it. The pastor acts like some sort of dictator. I've heard this expression before, that the pastor is the king and the pastor's wife is the queen, or sometimes they call him, they act like he's the president or the CEO, and the pastor's wife is the first lady. Have you ever heard that expression for a pastor's wife? All of that is complete nonsense. That's just made up stuff that man have made that actually makes shepherds something greater than the Bible says that they are. We have to be very careful that we don't look at pastors that way. I think with all the technological advances of our civilization, it is possible to follow different teachers. And this is where it becomes really dangerous, because these men are not necessarily pastors. In fact, in some cases, you end up following a person not even qualified to be a pastor because you don't know the guy. You just like the way he speaks on the internet, or you like his podcast, the way they talk. The Bible does not envision this. I'm sorry, I jumped to voluntary submission. The Bible does not envision this as an activity for the church members as a rule. God commands church members to be persuaded by their own pastor, not by someone who has a large ministry. So the congregation rules the church. The congregation submits to the leading of the pastor, but the pastor submits to the congregation as well. There's a mutual submission between pastors and church members alike, saying, we will mutually submit to one another. I think this is what you find in 1 Peter 5. And in doing so, both are fulfilling necessary roles and functions that make the body of Christ what God desires. In doing so, they bring glory to Him. Now, look at the personal reflection questions. Here's what I want you to think about this week. Do you actually see Jesus as the head of this church? If you don't, we failed somehow. If you can't say clearly Jesus is the head of College Park, then somewhere we're dropping the ball. And I'm okay with saying we're not where we should be. But I'm not okay with staying there. So if we're failing in some one of these areas, we need to make changes. And if our church people cannot see that Jesus is exalted as the head of College Park, then we need to make some changes. Do you see a connection between your relationship to Jesus and the pastor? In the sense that Jesus is the great shepherd and the pastor is my under shepherd. He's the one in the place of Christ in this church. And do you take seriously a high bar of responsibility for the pastor? And are you unwilling to let it down, even if it means confrontation? That means you coming to me and saying, hey, you're not living up to your standard. I will tell you that too many churches allow their pastors to get away with things that they never should. The first church I was in, I was living in, kind of like Joe, I was living on the property in the church there in Pennsylvania. And they had right across from, they had a little house, and right across from the house where Becky and I were living, they had the teen room. And the teen room looked like it had been a home, or a little building that was used as a home. And they had a Pac-Man game. That was really great, because when I had nothing to do, I could just go play Pac-Man. And it was the big stand-up arcade thing, with the yellow joystick. It was really great. But in this room, I found out later that the pastor who had been the previous pastor, before I got there, as a youth pastor, the previous pastor's son had lived there as an adult. adult son. And every Sunday morning, the deacon, because it was used as a teen room, he was living there with his wife or girlfriend. And in there, they would the deacons would go into that room because they got to clean it up for the teens. And they would have to get rid of all the dirty magazines. And they'd have to throw away all the beer cans into the trash can that the young man was drinking and all of this. And that was the lifestyle he was living. They had to get rid of all that so the teens could come meet there. And that he was living on the church property that way, not paying rent or anything, because the pastor didn't know what to do with it. And to me, somebody should have said, no, that's not right. This is sin. This doesn't belong. You can't keep doing this. This must change. It must change pretty quickly. But nobody in that church was willing to stand up to that man and say, no, this is wrong. And to me, that's evidence of a weak church, not a strong church. It's not compassion. That's weakness. I mean, if you see something in my life, you think I'm off, I want you to come and say, let's talk about it. I'm not going to let you play gotcha with me and say, hey, let's meet, but I'm not going to tell you what it is and surprise you to see your reaction. So that later, I'm kind of held to that reaction. But I will love to sit and contemplate and pray over with you something you see in my life where I'm off or in my family. That's fine. I'm okay with that. I really don't mind at all. That's good. That's accountability that ought to be there. I do the same for you, by the way. So I think if I see something in your life, I could have come sit down with you and say, and some of you know that I've done that. So you sat down beside you and say, hey, we got to talk about something. That's how it ought to be. Then look at the discipleship questions. How seriously do you take the office of pastor? Is there